request. So.
Sounds great. Thank you very much, Christine.
We're live.
Okay. Perfect. Well, in that case, Bryn, you're up. While Bryn's getting set up, I do want to just give a quick note that Susan Baker sent me an email last month or the month before saying she had taken a job in Washington State and was moving up there. So she has resigned, if you will, from the committee. We normally take a look at our committee membership in November. And so we'll be sending out solicitation for members, for new members soon, and we'll go through that process of vetting letters of interest and having a proposal for the Water Resources Commission in November. I guess second terms expiring, will be saying goodbye to, looks like, Marshall this year. And as I skim down, that is the only person I see expiring this year with their second term. So just want to make a special recognition of Marshall. Hope you can join us in November as well. All right, and then I've got Bryn's presentation here. And so, Marshall or Tim, I can see both of you. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the presentation on your screen? Perfect.
Yep, it's there.
Okay. And I'll try and get rid of this clutter for the rest of the group. All right, go ahead, Bryn.
Great. Good morning, everybody. My name is Bryn Hudson. For those of you who I have not yet met, I am the legislative coordinator for the Water Resources Department. And today I'm going to be giving you all an update on the 2023 legislative session, as well as the forthcoming 2023-2025 biennial budget as adopted by the legislature. So you can go next slide, Justin. So just a quick recap for those of you who were not eating, sleeping, and breathing legislature. So the session ended on June 25th of 2023. And this is what we call the long legislative session. In odd numbered years, there's a 6-month session. Even numbered years, we have a 5-week session. In the long sessions, we typically see large policy issues being tackled, biennial budgets are adopted and hashed out. And during this session, we see over 2,500 measures introduced on average. We track about 500 of those at any given time. And this session in particular, there were over 80 pieces of water quantity specific pieces of legislation. So it was a really, really busy session for us. So for those of you who were watching the news, this busy session culminated in a $143 million drought package. And these numbers are from a press release from Representative Helm's office. These are not our numbers. And these investments are shared across a suite of agencies, not just the department. If you want a more in-depth look into kind of all of the different pieces of water legislation and climate legislation that were addressed during session, we do have a legislative summary for those of you who are in the room. There's a paper copy, and for those of you who are online, we can get you a digital version as well. That is a 7-page document that kind of has everything you need to know and some stuff that you didn't want to know wrapped up. Today, I am really going to focus on groundwater and kind of integrated operational investments and policy issues that impact the department. It will not be an all-encompassing summary because we don't have hours to talk about this. But there was a big emphasis largely on direct appropriations for water project improvements, as well as in-stream priorities and watershed work. So that's where we saw, as you can see up on the screen, kind of the biggest monetary investment. You can go to the next slide, Justin. So in terms of WRD's budget, we saw a total funds increase of about 33% from what we received in the 2021-2023 biennial legislatively approved budget. This includes our current service level. This does not include one-time federal funds or one-time direct appropriations. We received a 33% increase based on what that current service level is. In total, we received 20 permanent positions that we did not already have. 18 of those are brand new positions. 2 of them are limited duration positions that were made permanent from the last biennium. So overall, though, an increase in 20 permanent positions, which is exciting. Next slide, please. I won't go over every single red circle on this slide, but really the goal here is to show how much of a focus there was on a variety of water related topics, not just water quantity. So all the red circles are essentially just areas of the integrated water resources strategy that received either a budgetary investment, either through WRD's budget or other agencies' budgets or policy work. If you are interested in what every single bill, what recommended actions on this legislative summary, there is a crosswalk. So if there's a particular bill that you're interested in, you can find that on all this entire summary. You can crosswalk all those recommended actions. But this is just really to focus and highlight how much interest there really was in water this session. And we'll move on. You can go next slide, Justin, to what we have to look forward to in terms of implementation. Again, this is a pretty high level overview. It's not all encompassing. But we did receive some permanent staffing to work on the integrated water resources strategy. This is one of those limited duration positions that became permanent. And so this staff person will really focus on implementation of the IWRS, developing updates and kind of coordinating across state, local, and federal governments to ensure that we're all coordinated on our implementation actions. Additionally, there was some policy work done on the IWRS, including extending the required update timeline from 5 years to 8 years. So it extends that time frame for the department and other agencies to actually work on implementation and less time on doing updates to the IWRS and more time on focusing on projects and implementing. And then there's also some provisions within the bill that did that policy work to require some biennial work plan development for increased agency coordination and transparency on the actual work being done on water in the state across agencies. We also received staffing to update our water availability data model. And so with this, without going too in depth, this is our WARS, the water availability reporting system model that we use to forecast surface water availability. And what this package essentially did was provide a dedicated team to coordinate research, outreach, project management, and technical activities around refining data estimates and really updating the model to be more reflective of current conditions. So we received quite a few staff to help with that update as well. You can go next slide, Justin. There's also, this is slide 1 of 2 in terms of policy work that we need to do. So there's a lot of policy directives and policy work that we've got slated. The first is around supporting resolution of complex issues in the Umatilla. So we received some funding to work on the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation water rights settlement. So we have a high level senior position that we received out in that area to kind of be the lead and coordinate that work. We also received some limited duration resources to coordinate with DEQ on how we can develop recommendations and expand water reuse and recycled projects and programs, and then report those recommendations to the legislature. So DEQ is lead, but we do have some limited duration resources to help support them in that work. And then we were also directed to update a scope of work as well as cost estimate and timeline for implementing the 1998 Stewardship and Supply Initiative. For those of you who are not familiar, if you do have questions, I'm happy to send you that original document. But it's a pretty old document that kind of lays out river basin assessments and how that connects to planning across the state and connecting data to communities. And so it's an old document, but legislature would like us to dust it off and do some updates to be more reflective of what the state of Oregon needs at this point in time. You can go to the next slide, Justin. And then we also received one of the pieces of legislation that was really exciting was making our integrated place-based water resources planning program permanent. And so that was a pilot program. Legislation was enacted this session to make that program permanent. So that was really exciting. We also received some limited duration staff to help either staff or contract out to advise, assist, and evaluate opportunities for groundwater users in the giveback to utilize voluntary water agreements. So we'll have some capacity there. And then there was also legislation that allowed the well abandonment repair and replacement fund to expand a bit and utilize those funds to replace household wells that have contaminant levels that are above drinking water quality standards. And there's also some provisions to coordinate with DEQ and OHA on that to make sure that we're in lockstep with our sister agencies. There's also a suite of enforcement bills that are largely related to cannabis, so I won't belabor those. There's one I'll get to in a few slides that this group might be most interested in. And then the final thing I'll touch on in terms of policy implementation is we did receive water use reporting authority, which essentially just means that on water rights that are already required to measure their stored or diverted use, we now have the authority to require that they report those measurements to the department. So we didn't previously have that authority. So you can go to the next slide, Justin. In addition to all of the policy work that we've got to implement, we also received a suite of grant loans and direct appropriations through our funding programs. So as I mentioned, place-based planning became permanent. So we also, with that authorizing legislation, received $2 million to go into that fund to support place-based planning across the state. In addition to some policy work around the water project grants and loans program, the policy work was really, we typically offer that on an annual cycle. The policy or the bill directs, one of the bills directs us to actually offer that on a 2-cycle year basis. So offer it twice a year rather than once a year. So in addition to that policy change, we also received $60 million into that program, 10 million of which is for your standard water projects, things like in-stream and out-of-stream water projects to evaluate, plan, and develop those solutions. And then another 50 million was actually earmarked for irrigation modernization funding, specifically for projects that are leveraging federal dollars. In addition to that pool of money, we also received about 16 million in direct appropriations. So those are just line items that go to particular entities already that we're the pass-through entity for that. Next slide, Justin. This is the last dense slide I have for you guys, so thanks for bearing with me. These are just kind of your other policy bills that you all might be interested in. The first is Senate Bill 85, which is the confined animal feeding operation bill, for those of you who were watching that saga unfold. So this is along with new water quality nutrient application permits that are administered largely by DEQ and ODA. The policy piece that this group is probably the most interested in is the stock water exemption that was addressed. So in this bill in particular, it capped stock watering for groundwater at 12,000 gallons per day for new operations. And then it capped that amount at 12,000 gallons per day for expanding operations that are located within critical groundwater areas. So those are kind of two separate buckets: new operations anywhere, and then expanding operations within critical groundwater areas. And one thing to note is that provision, those groundwater provisions actually sunset September 15th of 2027. So they're not permanent provisions. House Bill 2010, that is the large drought omnibus bill. That is kind of what all of the drought provisions were all kind of shoved into at the end of session. I've already kind of mentioned a lot of the other provisions directly related to the department that were passed in that bill, but another piece that might be relevant to you all is the Aquifer Recharge Grants and Loans Program that's actually established at Business Oregon, not with us. I believe we are going to be coordinating with them on some applications, but really this was a grant program that was established over at Business Oregon to fund aquifer recharge and storage projects in areas that have designated critical groundwater areas. So,
excuse me,
yep.
Projects or feasibility studies?
Projects, I believe.
I think maybe
Both.
both.
Yeah,
I'll have to take a look.
I'd have to pull the leg. It might be in here. I believe it was projects, and then I think there might be technical assistance and feasibility studies as well. But I believe this really cropped up in, we have funding caps on many of our programs that make them not necessarily suitable. I think that was the reason for moving into Business Oregon, as our existing funding programs have funding caps that make, yeah. So that is also a limited duration program. I believe the sunset is in 2032, which seems like a long ways away, but I promise it'll creep up. The enforcement bill that I mentioned is House Bill 2929, and that is actually a bill that gives the department injunctive authority, which essentially just provides the department the authority to seek an injunction in circuit court, requiring a person using water illegally to basically cease and desist from doing that illegal activity. It doesn't guarantee that we will get that injunctive relief. It just gives us the authority to actually be in a circuit court asking for it. So that bill gave us the authority to seek an injunction. This also has a sunset of 2030. And then we're required to report to the legislature in 2028 on our use and success of our use of this enforcement tool. And then House Bill 3343 is really an administrative cleanup bill that we realized when we were implementing House Bill 2145, which is the well construction modernization bill. We realized there was some discrepancies in how the licensing requirements were written across different welding experiences needed for different types of wells. And so this bill was kind of a rush to push through to give us the authority to actually have a little bit of nuance when we're doing those welding requirements for well constructors. So that one's just kind of administrative cleanup. And then the last thing I'll focus on, you can go to the next slide, Justin, is what we've got on the horizon. So over the interim between the end of this session and the start of the short session in February, we'll have legislative days. And so this is where the legislature will have special topics to come in and do some education, hearings to ask questions of agencies, do a little bit of learning. And so the first legislative days is actually happening right now or tomorrow, I guess the 27th through the 29th. And then we'll have a stint of ledge days in early November, and then we'll kick the new year off with a January 10 through 12 legislative days in 2024. And then that'll lead us into the short session, which is going to start in February, and that will go until the beginning of March 10th. So it's a short session. Typically the policy agenda for short sessions are theoretically smaller. They should be smaller than what you do over the 6-month period of long session. We're not doing large budgetary numbers moving around. It's cleanups, administrative, small policy things that are largely tackled in the short session. And then it's staggering to even say this, in the coming months, we are now preparing for the 2025 session and budget development. So I know we just finished up, but the biennial budget planning process is a long and fun one. So in the coming months, we'll be starting internal conversations and then doing some stakeholder engagement and outreach in the new year to kind of get the ball rolling on that. So that was a lot of information. I hope some of that was interesting and helpful. And I am free to answer any questions or provide any other background information. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, for years, I always thought one of the most important resources for the state is water was always under budgeted and underfunded. So it's exciting to see that you're getting some funds to do this. I would like to elaborate a little bit on $50 million for irrigation. Can you explain a little bit of what's happening there, what they're doing?
Yeah, so this was kind of an evolving issue over session. So I believe the nexus of this, and this was not something that we advocated for or asked for. This was given to us by legislative appropriations. But largely what the nexus is there's a whole bunch of federal dollars available for water projects, specifically irrigation modernization projects that require some degree of state or private match. And so what I believe the legislative intent is to give irrigation districts or water improvement projects an opportunity to access a pot of money at the state level available in order to leverage those federal dollars, to basically make those federal dollars go a little further with reduced state investment, but with a little bit of state investment. So that was initially the intent. Which agency was going to be the entity to actually get that money out the door was kind of debated all session long between us and OWEB and maybe there was just all sorts of conversations. Ultimately, I believe what happened was the fiscal of what OWEB, staffing that OWEB was going to need to actually get the funding out the door on a permanent basis was going to be too large. So the accountants actually basically made the call to give us the money because we have an existing water project grants and loans program with staff to essentially get that money out the door. So these are things like piping projects, conservation measures, equipment upgrade, things like that on a large scale. And those are lottery bond dollars, so they're not general funds, so they should be good for several years, not just a biennium.
Is the typical federal target for the other side of the funds for these kind of projects? So like Bureau of Reclamation, Water Smart, is that the typical? Okay.
I think Water Smart, I believe NRCS also has some funding. I'd have to do a little bit of research on like who the full scope, but I think BOR, NRCS are your usual faces.
So is there any availability for funds for ASR of that project and that money?
There's nothing in the bill that says you can't, but you would have to be a competitive irrigation modernization. It'd have to be an irrigation modernization project.
So
Yeah.
I had the same thought, and it's
Yeah.
really why I asked about Water Smart. And they have different categories, like the Water Smart's an umbrella, and they have all these different categories of the goals and objectives for these projects. And ASR fits into about 3 of them. And I'm working on 2 Water Smart funded projects now. So then it conceivably, you know, and if they result in a flow improvement in a stream, you know, or some more water availability, even if that's through ASR, right?
Right.
And then they can qualify.
Yeah. And one important thing to note is because it's going through the water project grants and loans program. I don't know how familiar you are with that, but there are a variety of public interest metrics that projects need to meet, including economic, social, ecological, like what's that third one? Requirements, kind of boxes that projects need to check in order to be competitive in that program. So there's that component, and then there's also the federal component as well.
And another you brought up was the well abandonment.
Yeah.
I'm glad to see that, because after being in the industry for 52 years, we see a lot of folks drilling wells that after they pay the cost of a well on pump, they need to abandon their well. They're supposed to within a year, but they don't have the funds to do it. And it's a great improvement that we can see they can reach out and grab some funds to do this. Most of the wells that are re-drilled to replace them are because they're either contaminated or they're lacking production. So that's, I'm glad to see that.
Yeah, it's exciting.
I have an additional question, and it may be a detail, not really. It's a detail of a project, so it might not be.
Yeah.
But we've heard a lot about the Harney Basin and the studies and the work that's been done out there. And so I saw a project, there's a partnership infrastructure to deliver water in Harney County. Just sort of curious about the broad stroke, deliver what water, where to who?
It's a great question. Is that one that's going through the Department of
Administrative Services?
Yeah.
Direct appropriation.
We also had that same question. I believe it's an irrigation modernization project. That is what my understanding is. I don't have the details in particular.
Okay.
I believe Representative Owens was the representative who kind of advocated for those funds. So I would direct you to their office for project details.
I recognize that was a detail, not a.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Any questions for Brent? Thank you for that update.
Yeah, I appreciate y'all letting me talk to you.
Thanks. All right, next up on the agenda, D is the start card fee update. We give this annually to the Groundwater Advisory Committee. And Jennifer Brown is going to present that. And Jennifer, just want to make sure you're okay sharing your screen. If not, I can pull it up from here.
Well, let's go ahead and try it.
All right.
Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Looks good.
Wonderful. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Brown. I'm an accountant in the Administrative Services Division, and I'm here today to provide the annual start card report as required in rule as a part of GWAC duties defined in ORS 537-762 subsection 5. This slide shows us the historical rates for the start cards. The fee is set in ORS 537-762 subsection 5 and is currently $350, which became effective January 1st, 2022 with House Bill 2145, which was passed in the 2021 legislature. In regards to allocation of resources, ORS 537-762 subsection 13 states that the start card fee revenue shall be paid into the Water Resources Department operating fund, and that the funds can be used to pay costs of the department to employ personnel and inspect wells and well construction. Additional information on allocation of resources is defined in ORS 537-763 subsection 4. It sets the biennial limitations on expenditures in the Water Resources Operating Fund to be no less than 5% of well inspection administrative support, no less than 20% on well inspection technical and information services, and no less than 70 no less than 75% for well inspection, field investigation, and enforcement. I think I misspoke. I think I meant to say no more than 5% on administration and no more than 20% on technical. Sorry if that was confusing. Just to further clarify, for the most part, start card fees are related to positions. In regards to admin funds, we're currently funding 0.68 FTEs, which is made up of 5 different positions. In regards to technical funds, we have 1 full-time data tech in the IT department. And with field and enforcement funds, we have 8 full-time positions and a portion of the well construction and compliance manager position funded there. The total FTEs in the current biennium budget is 9.87. And in total, that's made up of 15 positions, of which some are partially funded, as I stated. Here is the total expenditure budget. We're comparing the 2021-23 legislatively approved budget to the 2023-25 legislatively adopted budget. We're going to hone in on line 2, the other fees other funds including fees, which this is where we report the start card fees. It also includes other fee revenue and some other revenues. The $19 million limitation, you'll notice on line 2, is consistent pretty much for both bienniums that we're reporting here. Not much has changed in the budgeting. This slide is showing our power and water fees as a whole for the 2023-25 legislatively adopted budget numbers. So referring back to the last slide, this is a major portion of the $19 million we just looked at on that second line. And it details $12 million, as I stated, of power and water fees that are projected. Start card revenue is projected to be, you'll see here, $2,170,000 for the current biennium. Additional items within that $19 million include charges for services like gauging agreements, shared service agreements, assistant water master contracts, and as well as items like the new place-based water planning fund. Just noting percentages, the start card fees are a little less than 1% of the overall department budget, and just 17.6% of this fee budget. And as a whole, power and water fees make up around 4.5% of our department budget. Here is the annual count of start card fees activity. We get these numbers by dividing the total of the start card fees received by the going rate of the time period. So January 1, 2022 and 2023 here would have been $350 was the rate. January through 2023. The monitor wells are shown here in red and the water wells are shown in green. From 2012 to 2021, you'll see for most of the years there was increases in wells. And then we see a slight decrease in 2022 and then 2023 also, especially when considering the increase in the rate during those years. Just looking at the wells in comparison, the monitor well rates have been relatively flat, whereas there's some fluctuation in the water wells we see on here. Here is the start card revenue collections over quite a few biennias. We can see the revenues are steadily going up, and we see a bigger jump between the 1921 and the 21-23 biennias, that to be bigger because of that fee increase from House Bill 2145. And in regards to the 2023-25 budget, we're anticipating 3,100 start cards per year. That's how we're getting that projection, which is pretty consistent with the previous biennium, if you can see that. So this chart here it shows the spending by category again, administrative, technical, and field and enforcement, as we saw on slide 4 earlier. Administration is shown in the blue here on the bottom. And it's remained in compliance with statute by remaining at less than 5% of total expenditures. For the 2017-19, 2019-21, and 21-23 biennia, there were no administrative expenses at all, if you notice that, that were paid by the start card revenues. And that was done in an effort to manage the budget. As you'll see further ahead in the presentation, with the change in fund balance, that was part of the reason for that. And in regards to the 2023-25 projection, there is some projected for administrative, but as the budget's managed, that may change. It's just a projection. Just wanted to note that, but most definitely we will stay within that 5% or less of expenditures to remain in compliance. The technical is in the green in the middle, and once again, it's remained in compliance over the bienniums, and at the less than 20% of total expenditures. And then you'll see the technical for 21-23 looks quite low, and that's due to the data tech position being vacant. We're assuming in the current biennium that position will be filled the entire time. And then in regards to field and enforcement, it's in the brown. And just like the others, we remain in compliance with the statute at 75% or more of expenditures. You'll notice that in 2021-23, it was 98% of expenditures, and we're projecting it to be at least 81% of expenditures in the current biennium. This slide represents the projected change in start card fund balance. You can also think of this as the start card checking account if it makes it translate a little easier, where revenues are deposits and expenditures are withdrawals from a checking account. We began the biennium with 1.38 million in fund balance. We're expecting to bring in 2.2 million in revenues and projecting expenditures of 2.6 million. In other words, our expenses are outpacing our revenues, which brings us to a $400,000 projected decrease in fund balance. And this is mainly due to a large cost of living adjustment from the collective bargaining agreements, as well as inflationary increases in the purchasing of goods and supplies. To note further, we anticipate the 25-27 biennium, we would see revenues remaining relatively flat while still being impacted by inflationary impacts, and which could likely further erode the fund balance for start cards. In summary, the start card revenue is less than 1% of our total department budget. In regards to FTEs, historically, we've funded 9 to 11 positions. It's revenue dependent. Like I stated before, we have 9.87 FTEs according to the budget, the current budget. And then we are anticipating or expect to see approximately 3,100 start cards annually, and that's where we're budgeting our revenue off of. Moving on to historic groundwater use recording fees. This slide is the revenues that we've collected since 2009. And per ORS 537-545, the fee is $300. One thing to note on here is in House Bill 2145, the collection of these fees changed from the landowner's responsibility over to the driller's responsibility. So we're now collecting these fees from the drillers. And I guess I can say, we're averaging about 1.58 million annually on these fees. In regards to groundwater use recording expenditures, we are averaging about 1.4 million per biennium. And we are expecting an increase in expenditures between last biennium and the projected current biennium. I will say that these fees fund 5 hydrogeologists. And moving on. This is our historic geotech revenue. And we've collected these also since 2009. The fee is $25 for the first hole in a location, and then $10 for all holes thereafter. You'll see that the graph depicts a steady decline in revenues, and I'll just say that we are currently working with the program to look into why this may be occurring. And this is our historical geotech expenditures graph, and they're basically mainly position driven. It's based on our assumption that all positions will be filled in the 23-25 biennium. There was we'll see, you see quite a bit lower expenditures in 29-21, or sorry, 2019-21. And then also there were quite a bit less expenditures in 21-23. That was due to vacancies, positions not filled, and we're assuming that we'll have the needed positions filled in the current biennium. And that's the end of the presentation. Any questions?
Here.
Oh. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Good job.
Wow, easy. Okay, thank you. And stop sharing.
There we go. Perfect. Thanks again, Jennifer. Okay, just want to take a quick skim to make sure we haven't picked up any other GWAC members except Marshall. Look like it. All right, so last item on the agenda before public comment period is rulemaking updates. I'm going to give a quick update on some that are just starting up, some that are finishing, some that are in progress, and we'll finish up with the groundwater allocation rulemaking. And I'll spend most time on that and pull up the presentation that I've got prepared for the commission on Thursday. Preview that to GWAC, get your input, and talk with you about how we want to take GWAC advice to the commission on the groundwater allocation piece in the future. Let's start with House Bill 3343. Bryn mentioned that in her presentation. That is the statutory fix that allowed us to not require monitoring well constructors to have a welding proficiency. Since I believe those were mostly, if not totally, PVC cased wells. So want to acknowledge that I think that came out of REC discussions, and I know that Floyd brought that up at GWAC here as well. So we're going to be starting another rulemaking to implement that House bill. And the goal is to, again, allow the department to have discretion to apply that welding proficiency requirement for well licenses for monitoring well drillers. We're planning to convene just one RAC to review the draft language to remove that welding proficiency, I think based on the fact that there was extensive discussion on it. We're hoping to have that RAC meeting in the next couple months. And I believe right now we have reached out to House Bill 2145 RAC members, the original group that brought up the need for this fix, and asked them about their availability. So we're trying to get together that same group, which I assume Floyd means that you got or will get soon some communication on that. And we'll go from there. So any questions about the well construction drillers? Nope. Okay. Okay. Next one I will touch on is Division 10. That is the critical groundwater area designations administrative process rules. We have that on the commission agenda for adoption on Thursday. The GWAC, if you recall, during our kind of off-cycle meeting, I believe it was in May, had a recommendation that we notify tax lot owners, and that was incorporated into the rule language. So I just want to acknowledge that. I just want to double check that real quick that I said that correctly.
And that was on the paperwork you sent us with the
Yep.
email.
Great, perfect. So that was the goal, and just want to make sure. Sorry, I should have had this pulled up ahead of time. Just want to make sure that you guys, that I give you feedback on, advice received and implemented. So, the one caveat is we didn't require that within municipal service area boundaries. I believe we chatted about that too. So, so yeah, we'll notify all tax lot owners within the effective area, but not within a municipal or quasi-municipal water service area. So that's where we ended up on that. Again, well, I should say, one other thing. We had received, or the commission had received, some comments that came in after the public comment period. In order to ensure that those got into the administrative record, we did open the public comment period for a short few days recently to get all those things cleaned up. And that kind of little extended public comment period ran through yesterday at 5 p.m. and we'll get those bundled up. And again, as I say, that's on the docket for a commission action item to hear the final rules and to give a vote, yea or nay, on adopting this. But that's almost the end on Division 10. And then Division 512 is the Malheur Lakes Basin Program rules. That's the administrative basin that includes the Harney Basin that we've been working on for quite some time and hearing about. I believe that Rules Advisory Committee has had 2 meetings. We're prepping for a third. And we've been, because of timing, we've been running that process in parallel with the Division 10, but we are discussing a critical groundwater area designation in the Harney Basin that will occur assuming Division 10 is adopted according to those rules. And so we've been working toward that objective. I'm going to invite Tim Seymour, our assistant groundwater section manager, who's been overseeing that 512 process along with Kelly Hines as our rules coordinator, to add in anything else pertinent.
Yeah, so just a comment on the Division 10 and Division 512 interfacing. In the Division 10 rules, we specifically added a section to call out the Division 512 rulemaking process and the fact that it is in process currently. In Division 10, there's a couple of provisions that require that the department do something prior to convening a RAC. And since we already have RACs going for Division 512, we decided to make a specific carve out in Division 10 to acknowledge that Division 512 is in process. And then to provide transparency to the public about what to expect for those provisions that are specifically stated that prior to the RAC, we're going to do this work. And so essentially we set a deadline for those items to be done prior to opening the public comment period. So 60 days prior to opening the public comment period for Division 512, we will provide the draft report that's required in Division 10. And we'll also initiate engagement with federally recognized Indian tribes, and we will initiate coordination with affected local governments related to land use planning. So the intent there being, it was impossible to meet the requirements of the Division 10 rules. And so we wanted to make it clear that we are going to follow the Division 10 rules with a couple of exceptions for those items that we couldn't meet because it simply wasn't possible. So that's the interfacing between Division 10 and Division 512. As far as Division 512 goes, the first couple of RACs have really been focused on laying the groundwork. We've talked about classification of groundwater in the Harney Basin with the intent of limiting further development outside of the critical groundwater area. Since the critical groundwater area, currently we have proposed the Greater Harney Valley groundwater area of concern boundary, the GIVGAC boundary, as the critical groundwater area boundary, and any development outside of that boundary within the Harney Basin would contribute to further declines within that area of concern. And so the intent there is to prevent future development from capturing recharge that comes in the uplands and makes its way into the lowlands. And so we've had that conversation with the RAC. The next conversation we had with the RAC was around the criteria for delineating boundaries and sub-area boundaries within the critical groundwater area. So as I said, we proposed the GIVGAC as the critical groundwater area boundary, but then within that large boundary, we put together some criteria for how we think we should delineate sub-area boundaries, and we'll be presenting that sub-area boundary map at the next RAC, which will happen October 25th. And the intent of those sub-areas is to allow us to apply administrative controls in a targeted fashion within the basin. Since the basin is one hydraulically connected system, but due to hydrogeologic composition, timescales vary in how reactive portions of the basin will be to curtailment. And so we don't want to have to apply really strict curtailment that might shut off users in one portion of the basin that would have limited to no timely effect on other portions of the basin where we actually need, or where we're seeing severe groundwater declines. And so the intent there of those sub areas, right, is to apply management to specific areas and allow us to really target our curtailment to the areas of most severe decline so that we can see timely results. And so that's where we're at in the process. Next conversations will be talking about criteria for curtailment. How do we decide which sub areas will be curtailed? And then we'll be talking about how do we determine what that curtailment is going to look like. And so the term in rule is now permissible total withdrawal. And that permissible total withdrawal, or PTW, is the allowable pumpage by sub area. So we'll be talking about how we get to that permissible total withdrawal number, and that's then going to set the curtailment. We'll also be talking about implementing a serious water management problem area to require metering throughout the area so that we can get to accurate water use and transparency and accountability around water use throughout the area. And then the last piece we'll be talking about is voluntary agreements. And in statute, the department and the commission are encouraged to, or required to, encourage and facilitate whenever possible voluntary agreements. And those voluntary agreements, if adopted by the commission, would control in lieu of an order. And so the intent there is to really put some guardrails around that and try to provide some clarity around how voluntary agreements will work within the critical groundwater area, with the intent of trying to get groundwater users to voluntarily curtail in whatever way they can to meet those curtailment goals, to reach a reduction in groundwater declines, and to do it in a way that is hopefully less impacting to them than following a strict prior appropriation system. So that would be the benefit of a voluntary agreement, is that it can go outside of prior appropriation, whereas our curtailment, our regulatory curtailment, has to follow prior appropriation. So hopefully we'll see groundwater users in the basin decide that voluntary agreements are the most effective way to get to the targets we're going to have to reach. And so we'll have to balance those two processes. So that's the Division 512 rulemaking, where we're at and where we're going.
Great, thank you, Tim. Any questions on 512? So again, that's in the relatively early stages, and we expect that that will be a topic for the Groundwater Advisory Committee to revisit for several more meetings. So I guess, Tim, do we have any targets for an adoption date set by the commission?
We're hoping summer, fall next year. If all goes well, we're hoping to go to public comment sometime in the February, March timeframe. And so that's when we'd be coming officially to the GWAC for comments, recommendations to the commission on the proposed rules. Obviously, that's subject to change based on how the conversations with the RAC go, and this is a challenging process, and so I anticipate we may see delays based on just the amount of information we're going to need to provide, and the challenging nature of the topic. Curtailing water use is never easy, and so we may see it take a little longer than that. So.
Okay, so we will revisit and, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Rich.
Wonder, one of the papers that Kelly had forwarded to us, some of the verbiage under the exempt well category mentioned only that the well had to penetrate the aquifer, unlike the old rules where it had to fully develop the aquifer. Was the intent the same to say that you had to penetrate it? Does that portend that exempt well user will then be told that they have to fully develop the aquifer if they have a problem? Or are we throwing out the short straw, long straw?
Well, okay, so I don't believe we're throwing out the terminology for fully penetrate the aquifer. I'll clarify that that is linked to the definition of substantial interference. So that's interference of one well pumping on another acutely, within a season, or at least within the impacts of one well's cone of depression on another. I guess, Kelly, can you clarify, or maybe Tim, I'm not sure, I'm not super familiar with the comment that we may have made.
So I'd need some more specifics on that. I will say there is an option in the orders process, so by which the commission can implement curtailment or other controls, that the commission does have the power to create a provision that accords preference without reference to relative priorities to essentially residential or livestock watering purposes first. And then after that, they can allow other types of use, but those have to be based on prior appropriation, and those withdrawals can't materially affect a properly designed and operating well with prior rights that penetrates the aquifer. So I don't believe we have changed in any place our language relating to fully penetrating the aquifer. with relation to Division 10 and the critical groundwater area process. So.
Is this a well construction language?
I don't remember the exact location.
Okay.
There was a lot of reading
Yeah.
there, but I picked up on the fact that it only said that you had to penetrate the aquifer rather than fully develop. I've been down this road. I live in a critical groundwater area, and as Justin's well aware, I've been the subject of this verbiage.
Yeah, and so the place where we state that it must penetrate the aquifer comes directly from statute, and so that is not an interpretation from us. That is us quoting what the legislature put in statute.
But to me, there's a distinct difference between penetrating and fully developing. And if that comes directly from statute, that's fine. That answers the question. That's why you used it, and I understand that.
Yeah. So Richard, I'll work with Tim and.
I don't mean to be a
and follow up.
nitpicker
No,
about that,
no,
but-
that's totally fine. I appreciate you bringing it up, and I'll have a more specific answer for you. I'll venture a guess, always risky, that it applies to even though I understand all this stuff can get mashed together, the substantial interference versus a critical area designation, for example, to maintain reasonably stable water levels, relate to impacts over different time periods. So the substantial interference that requires this full penetration relates to, again, well-to-well interference, where the cone of depression is impacting it, where you can turn on a well and see a water level response in another well. And I think because this is a common question, I'll elaborate. Like, my understanding is that the Oregon Groundwater Act is intended to fully utilize seasonal storage in the aquifer, and that is why we have that full penetration clause. Is in August or September, when everybody's been pumping for the whole summer and water levels are at their lowest, wells should fully penetrate to obtain the water in that aquifer. Now, that also assumes, with the reasonably stable water levels, that every winter water levels recover to some reasonably stable level. And so where we have the critical area designations, or one of several reasons to have or authorizations to have a critical area designation, is that those year-on-year spring high water levels are falling year-on-year. So we're using up storage that's not being replenished annually. And that difference in seasonal impact versus year-on-year, I believe, plays into why the different standards. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks again, Tim and Kelly. Appreciate that. All right. So for the last part of this, and to bring it home, I'm going to go to the allocation rulemaking process, which has multiple divisions. And I'll say that we finished up our final planned Rules Advisory Committee meeting. I think that was just last month in August. That was the 6th RAC meeting we had. We continued to take RAC comments into account and adjust the rule language. Came up with something in our most recent iteration that we believe continued to help clarify the rule language, remove multiple references to multiple rules where we could. And so we're at the point now where we are planning to open the public comment period in November and have that run through February 1st, so a 90-day public comment period. We intend to present, welcome William. We intend to present a broad overview to the commission on Thursday, relatively brief, and give them again kind of a primer on the big picture, if you will. And I plan to kind of preview that for GWAC today. And then we intend to have a much more detailed discussion in the November commission meeting, where we go through specific rule language, give examples, more detail. So at that point, we are also planning, we'll be in the public comment period by that point, by November, that's the plan. And we are then planning a number of public hearings for the rules. Planning to travel to the same places we had the informational sessions ahead of the Rules Advisory Committee. So Medford, Bend, LeGrand, Salem, to give folks the opportunity to provide their public comments on the rules. And at this point, our time schedule is to present the rules for adoption to the commission at their first meeting of the year, which I don't think has been scheduled yet, but the idea that I'm aware of is that it'll be in March. So I did want to have a discussion with the committee today about how you folks feel about having a meeting where we talk about that rule language during the public comment period for any advice that you want to provide as a motion as a group to the commission. So similar to what we did for the Division 10 rules. For Division 10, we had a separate meeting kind of off our normal scheduled plan because that was when it fit in the public comment period. I'm happy to have a separate meeting just to have that one agenda item again too. That's totally fine. Or right now, it looks like we will be in the public comment period when we have our November meeting, which, oops, I'm sorry. I just hit the wrong button. Moment. All right, try that again here. Sorry, folks online, I just shut off our big screen. Okay, next meeting that we have planned is November 14th. So we could also plan to just have, you know, for the most part, that one big item on the agenda and talk about it. Also happy to meet in November with that intent, and if we need more time, we can schedule another meeting between then and February 1st within the public comment period to continue discussions. That's an option as well.
I know you probably haven't planned that far ahead.
Yeah.
But if we allocated the bulk of the time to this on the November 14th meeting, what does that displace? Was there anything on the agenda yet, or what?
No,
Yeah.
there's nothing on the agenda right now. So we've addressed, especially with today's earlier presentations, all of the kind of required or standard meetings or topics that we hold with the committee, and really these regularly scheduled meetings that happen the Tuesday before the commission meeting are intended to give you an update for anything that's in front of the commission. And right now that commission agenda isn't set, so I don't know what other groundwater things might be on there, but for the most part, I think that this is going to be the big one from the groundwater section. So, or that's groundwater related, I should say. So,
Question?
yeah, go ahead.
First of all, I'm glad to hear that, you're planning on setting aside time for GWAC to consider these and comment. Is there any particular reason why is there some significance to us having our discussion during the public comment period? So that's my question. Then I have something else. So, but is
Yeah.
that a deal?
Yeah, we can discuss now and whenever. However, when and if the committee wants to provide input to the commission, we decided some years ago that should really happen within the public comment period to be in compliance with the Secretary of State's processes for rule adoption. So if the committee is, again, advising the commission on rule language or rule input, it should really happen within that public comment period. So we can discuss today, but if we had a quorum and we wanted to give, a motion that everybody votes on and puts their name on so that the body, the Groundwater Advisory Committee, advises the commission, I would ask that we wait till November or make another meeting in that public comment period.
Yeah, well, I'll just state, I don't understand, since we're not a member of the public, and our mandate in rule and statute is to advise the commission on all matters related to groundwater. I'm not arguing with you, but it seems weird that we aren't in compliance with the Secretary of State's office unless it's during the public comment period. That's neither here nor there. I will say this, I hope you do it in November so I can be part of the discussion, because these rules are sort of near and dear to my heart a little bit, but whatever. The other thing is, regardless of that, I think it would be important that the rules are mature enough that we're not commenting prior to additional changes due to public comments or whatever else. So I think it seemed like when we were looking at the Division 10 rules, I can't remember what it was that triggered that special meeting, and that off-cycle meeting, and I'm not suggesting we ponder that. But it would be nice if the GWAC, whether or not I'm still on it, ponders weighs in on the rules when they're pretty mature, and not too early in the process when there's going to be subsequent changes. I guess that's the main point I wanted to make here. But I am really super glad that you're planning on setting aside time in the Groundwater Advisory Committee for some serious discussion, because that's our only real true job. Thanks.
Yeah, sure thing. So I guess I'll mention two things in response to that, Marshall, is I do believe that we're at a fair point where the rules have gone through several iterations over the 6 RAC meetings for us to talk about them in earnest. Also, our kind of final RAC input deadline is Friday, and we're going to have the commission meeting agenda item on Thursday with discussion, and I suspect there's going to be a good deal of public comment for the commission as well. So I think this is a good place to start for any last minute edits we might make before we submit for the Secretary of State. And at that point, those are the proposed rules up until the commission adopts or tells us to go back to drawing board. So November, again, the reason we're waiting on the final details to present the actual rule language is just to make sure we get that final RAC comment period that we present to everybody here today, to the commission Thursday, and go forward from there. So.
That all makes sense. I don't disagree with any of that. So that sounds good.
But to Marshall's point, public comment does run through February 1st.
Correct.
And probably goes to the commission, you said in probably March, though that's not.
That's the target, yeah.
And we don't have a 2024 GWAC schedule.
Correct.
So if we did have a meeting prior to the commission meeting, March.
Yeah.
We could be made aware of any additional changes to the rule, but we wouldn't have an opportunity to provide an opinion or a comment about those changes to the commission. We'd be aware of it, but we'd be outside the public comment period at that point.
That is correct.
Right. I guess it didn't occur to me that they have to go to the Secretary of State's office so far ahead of time. But yeah, regardless, I think November works great, or we just don't want to be 2 days before the commission meeting pondering these rules and with no realistic time for the department to react to our comments.
Which could happen if there was any substantial changes from additional post-November public comment.
Correct.
Right.
But I don't know, maybe I'll invite Laura, if Laura's on. I actually don't know, like, if we get substantial comment and the rules change, I just am not sure how we would handle that. So that's unknown to me, and maybe that's unknown to everybody until we see what comes in. So
We can adjust. I'm fine with making that the primary agenda item in November. It doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
Fine.
all right, well, let's plan on that. And like I say, we can always decide something else at the end of the November meeting if we feel like we need more time or want more.
So my understanding, you're gonna have a commission meeting coming up.
Yes,
So comments that we make today means we don't have a quorum or not taken to the commission, or is that correct?
that's correct. But also I'm happy to have your kind of big picture comments, and yeah, we'll certainly take those into account, but we can't,
Well,
I guess without, you need a quorum to make a motion to send something to the commission.
I have quite a few. Misplaced my, I don't know what it's at. I had notes and everything I wanted to talk about, so I printed this up out in a hurry and just kind of scratched this, so I apologize for not having fully able to go to this, but I have some concern the way you're using modeling instead of scientific data with the visuals they have. What we're doing,
Okay.
Modeling basically to me is not scientific. If we're gonna do, groundwater management and withdrawal of production wells, I think it's gonna have a large impact on, not only the drilling industry, however, I think the drilling industry, 95% of their income from domestic wells, not large production wells, which you're targeting. So, but for agriculture, I think it's gonna have an impact on, agriculture, to quite an extent. I think we should be using more scientific data on how we collect it. And, I've been reading over a project that you referred to as WARS. Can you explain a little bit of that to me? Because I'm somewhat trying to figure out how that determines groundwater availability.
Sure. So I guess, Floyd, if I could ask you to hold tight, I will take some time, and we're running beyond the agenda. I want to acknowledge that. I assume that's fine. I've got it held till, well, we'll be here until y'all decide we should stop, but let me give an overview so everybody's on the same page, and then we can chat about that if that works for you. Okay. Just checking in with Marshall. All right, so again, let me make sure that we okay. All right. So, oh, you know what? I'm sorry, I gotta share the screen first.
Hey, Justin.
Yeah,
Good morning.
good morning, Annette.
I joined the Zoom because I was listening on YouTube and I heard the discussion around the commission process. And so I just wanted to clarify that after the public comment period closes and the department considers public comments to develop whatever the final proposal is to the commission, we will not be able to preview that with the Groundwater Advisory Committee until those rules will not be available until they are posted on the commission website. So we will need to take feedback from the Groundwater Advisory Committee. Certainly you can provide feedback today, but also during the public comment period. So just wanted to clarify that based on the discussion that I was hearing as I was listening on YouTube.
Thank you. Just so everybody's aware that Annette is the administrator for the Technical Services Division. So. All right. With that, I'm going to and can somebody verbally tell me, can you see the first slide, item B, groundwater allocation process?
We
Not
don't
yet.
see- we
Not
don't see
yet.
screen share.
Okay, I apologize. I had this. Oh, there we go. I think that'll work now. Okay.
Now we see the presentation.
Perfect. Marked as well here. Okay, that should work. All right, so again, quick preview of a near final presentation we're going to present on Thursday. Already mentioned that this is intended to be a high-level overview to make sure folks are oriented, and we're planning a longer presentation in November with proposed language and examples of application. So today, trying to orient the Groundwater Advisory Committee and kind of just build a general common understanding for discussions, and Floyd's got some, which is great. Look forward to that. Want to mention that these rulemakings are addressing integrated water resource strategies 10G, which is strengthen water quantity and water quality permitting programs, as well as 11E, which is develop additional groundwater protections. And we can come back to that if there's questions at the end. This presentation is broken into 3 parts. Gonna give kind of short review and background and reason for rulemaking. So everything in there are slides that I presented before, or at least figures and such I presented before, just to remind everybody of where we're at today. And then I'm going to spend most of the time talking about a few key issues of the rulemaking, comments we heard back from the RAC, and kind of why things shook out the way they did. And then just a final slide on the rulemaking schedule to wrap things up. So first section here, short background. So I want to make sure that I again orient us to what I've titled here, the key groundwater concepts. So first of all, I want to keep in mind that groundwater is a flowing component of the water cycle. It receives recharge from precipitation, snowmelt, what have you. Water flows through that groundwater system, which is, I'll say, full of dynamic storage. So think of that as perhaps a charged irrigation canal, right? Like there's some amount of water there, and there's water coming in the top end, flowing through that charged system and coming out someplace else. It's a flowing system, and there's discharge that's before development in balance with recharge, and that discharges commonly to springs, stream flow, base flow. I've got this picture of a set of springs in the Metolius River system where there's 100 plus CFS popping out of the ground here. This is one of the I guess less common places where you can actually see this happen, but this happens throughout streams in Oregon. And so given that background, the source of groundwater pumped from wells comes from two places. Initially, when the pump turns on, a bit of that dynamic storage, that charge system is pulled out, but as that's pulled out, that cone of depression expands, and in a groundwater system that is hydraulically connected to surface water, eventually after a long enough time, that water is derived from stream flow depletion. So I made a cheesy little comic here, but put in a well. That well is drilled down into these flow paths, and if we take water out, we're intercepting water that's along a flow path to discharge someplace else. Okay. So those are the key concepts I want to make sure that we keep in mind as we go forward here. So as far as groundwater development in the state of Oregon goes, this is an older slide from 2016 presentation, but I'll reuse it here. I don't think that the ultimate numbers have changed a ton. So 1955 is when the Groundwater Act was adopted. That is when well log reporting became mandatory. Before that, we had about 4,660 well logs, mostly in the records of the department, kind of going out and looking at irrigation wells as well as from the USGS. And over the intervening 65-ish years, we're up to more than 250,000 well logs across the state. And you can kind of see the warmer the color on the right here, the more dense the number of wells per, this is per township, it looks like. Maybe that's per section. I'll have to make sure that I translate that 640 acres. So in any case, a lot more well logs. About 90% of those well logs are for exempt groundwater uses. So those are uses that don't require a water right permit. So household domestic, stock water that's limited recently by the bill we heard Bryn talk about, single use industrial commercial, and there's some other less common ones. But as Floyd had started to point out, most of the wells drilled, most of the water wells are 90%-ish plus are for these exempt uses. And I want to say up front, those are not impacted by the rules that we're proposing to change. So I also want to say that this 250,000 plus wells that we see up here, 10% of which roughly are operate under water right permits or certificates, they will also not be affected. So these rules are forward-looking and will affect the future or proposed additional permitted groundwater uses. So that with respect to the number of wells and the actual amount of water taken out of the groundwater system, again, this is a figure that I first presented in 2016. So the values have edged up a little bit, probably in both categories, but for the most part are relatively similar magnitude. So I've got types of uses along the bottom there. And the blue bars are the percent of water wells by type. So again, we've got our 250,000 roughly total. And red bars are the percent of usage, groundwater usage by type. That's built on a 2.4 million acre feet per year total estimated by the USGS for 2010. Again, that will have fluctuated a bit in the past decade, but I would expect the magnitude to be roughly the same and the percentages to be roughly the same. So We've talked about this before. Domestic wells are by far the largest use category, but are estimated to use about 3% of groundwater across the state. Irrigation and community, that means in this case, quasi-municipal, municipal water uses are roughly 8% of water wells drilled and roughly 95% of groundwater use. So it's those permitted uses in the future, like growing those numbers in the future, that are affected by this proposed rulemaking. All right, so knowing that groundwater is part of the water cycle, knowing that we've permitted, what was it? Now I need to go back to make sure I get the number right. 2.4 million acre feet per year, roughly, and that anywhere that the groundwater system is hydraulically connected to surface water, then I will put out the issue statement as this, that groundwater allocation since 1955, when permitting began statewide, has contributed to groundwater level declines and reduced surface water base flow across the state. And as we permit new uses, those are coming at the expense of existing users, including in-stream flows and ecosystems. And at this point, those in-stream flows have relatively junior rights. However, they are senior to any future right that we may issue. So in this rulemaking, we're looking at future rights that that we understand are going to affect the resource that existing rights are dependent upon, and that existing users aren't getting their full allocated. And so in presenting this to the commission, they gave us a request that I've paraphrased for a couple of years now as update the groundwater allocation rules to be more sustainable and protective of existing water users, both in stream and out of stream. And we've talked about, of course, that we're proposing to update the groundwater allocation rules. That process has included our public outreach meetings that happened in fall of 2022, 6 RAC meetings that have occurred since April of 23. We've brought this up, I think, at the past 7 meetings of GWAC, and we've given commission updates since December of 21, and the process continues. But as we discussed earlier today, we're at the point of having a pretty good final proposed rule set. And so I think it's a good time, as Marshall brought up, to really have good discussion on how the rules look now and what they might mean going forward, what we expect them to mean going forward. So again, in our rulemaking, we have really focused on this water is available definition. And so I understand that this flow chart is small and can't read it on the screen. This was put together to support the Rules Advisory Committee and is available on our website under the rulemaking process for folks to grab and look at the details. But I'll just say this is a flow chart of our public interest presumption for issuing new water rights, starting with the statute 537-621 that gives what we've termed the 4-part test for the whether or not the public interest presumption is met. That includes basin program rules, potential for injury, other rules of the commission, and this 4th one, water is available. And that's really what we focused on in this rulemaking, is just that one part of the 4-part test, that water is available and everything else remains the same. I do want to point out that the statute has kind of a second part that basically says, if we get the comment from an applicant, from another interested party through a comment or on the department's initiative, that any of the policy statements that are laid out in statute in 537-525 aren't being met, then that can be taken into account too. So that includes things like thermal interference or water quality impacts that might occur. So if there's a proposed right near a groundwater contamination site, those are less common, but they do come up. They are still able to be pulled in if necessary, but they aren't part of the water is available definition that we've got kind of 3 points that we've defined it as. They're all water quantity points, and they are things that we will assess for each application and make a yes, no finding on. So our water level is reasonably stable. Will pumping a hydraulically connected system impact already appropriated surface water, already over appropriated surface water? And can the target aquifer produce the requested rate? So those are the 3 parts of water is available that we're proposing to assess. So just to give a comparison, today, water is available is defined as if the requested source is not over appropriated. And then over appropriated is defined in division 400. So you have to go from division 300 to 400 to find that. That means kind of 2 parts: that allocation is less than the average annual recharge. So we have this water budget component, and that it doesn't deplete over appropriated surface water. So in the first case, our data set on average annual recharge is generally at the basin scale. That has been really tough to implement because nothing is evenly distributed over a basin scale. So precipitation varies, subsurface hydrogeology varies, pumping concentration varies, everything varies with space. And so to have a basin-wide water budget isn't a great way to assess an individual application for a water right any place in that basin. And we have defaulted to looking at water levels to give us an indication of the water balance in that local area, basically on a local water balance. And that said, when we look at water levels, when we look at the rule of over appropriated is, we have linked to the definition of declined excessively as the trigger for whether or not the system is over allocated. So I'll talk about that real quick in the next slide. Before I move on, I want to say that the definition of over appropriated that includes this doesn't further deplete over appropriated surface water. We've developed the Division 9 rules, and we've really constrained that definition of over appropriated with Division 9 and the policy to, we don't have an impact from a well within a mile, and the impact has some threshold within a year. So we've taken this kind of broad statement, and for the past 20-ish years, we've really constrained that down. So want to note that. So coming back to declined excessively, this is defined in Division 8. It has a number of different components, but the ones we find most functional are these 2 here that, again, we're looking at lowering the annual high water level. So that's generally the water level in the springtime at the end of the recharge season before the irrigation season begins. And if that has dropped 50 feet below the highest known water level, or 15% of the greatest known saturated aquifer thickness, that would trip this declined excessively. So at this point, you're not over appropriated until you've declined excessively. We issue until we're over appropriated. So we're issuing right up until the point that we hit this threshold. That is also one of the criteria for initiating a critical groundwater area and potentially curtailing people back. As Tim pointed out, and I made note of because I wanted to bring it back up here, curtailment isn't easy, and we would prefer to manage on the allocation side of things rather than on the curtailing back side of things. I also want to point out that when we hit excessively declined, so this is an example hydrograph from the Butter Creek critical area. So this particular well went in 1971. The water levels were probably falling before that. It triggered excessively declined. 3 years later, 1974. Water levels continued to decline at 9 foot a year until we established a critical area. And then we weren't able to stop declines. We did reduce them, so the rate has gone down, but we're still declining over time. And so I just want to point out that trying to allocate groundwater based on this as one of the criteria is not as protective as it could be. So it's a slow and lagging indicator. Okay, so with that, I want to get into some of these key issues. So again, in order to address this, we've done a couple of things with water as available. The first thing we've done is we've defined reasonably stable water levels. That's a statutory policy that reasonably stable water levels be determined and maintained, I think is the language. And so without that having been defined, we never knew what we were looking for. And so one of the main proposals in the rule language is to say, you know, what is reasonably stable water levels? So first of all, we had to decide what sustainable means. We adopted a definition from a paper written by Gleason and others in 2020. And so this is our guiding principle, if you will. And essentially, this Gleason paper points out several theoretical, water level trends. This one in blue is what they term the dynamically stable range for physical groundwater sustainability. So we recognize that the groundwater system before any development still reacted to climate variability year on year, decadal cycles, ENSO cycles, and that's dynamically stable. It's in a general equilibrium. That's what we want to maintain. There's some other strategic or managed depletion thresholds. This one in gold, the strategic. This might be an example that we might use when looking at using groundwater as a drought mitigation program, where we might allow for more groundwater pumping over a relatively short period of time with the intent that we are going to use that water and then stop and allow it to recover in cyclical wet years. This red line is termed managed aquifer depletion. That's a policy of some other Western states, but that is not Oregon statutory policy. So just want to point out that exists as a potential strategy, but that's not supported by Oregon statute, at least. So with that, I also wanted to point out just some of the negative impacts, why we care about groundwater level declines. Well, heard a lot about drying up of wells, can also lead to reduced stream flow with the hydraulically connected streams. There can be deterioration of water quality, which we've started to see a bit of. Also, if wells go dry and folks are drilling deeper in some systems, that gets into older water that has reacted with the aquifer more, and you can get decreased water quality. And also there's increased pumping costs. And so in order to define reasonably stable water levels, we wanted to do a few things. We wanted to accommodate this dynamically stable range, this background cyclical up and down water levels. However, we wanted to, as quickly as we thought possible, identify declining water levels. So we don't want to allow declining water levels to be masked too much by the dynamically stable. And there's a host of complications with the water level record and the data we have. And when you start, do you start on an upswing? Do you start on a downswing? So we've tried to take that into account. We want to limit the definition from changing back and forth between stable and not, depending on where you are in a particular cycle. And we want to protect against long, slow declines toward levels that are trending toward meeting the definition of declined excessively. And so this is a paraphrase of our definition for reasonably stable water levels. We've defined that as half a foot or less of water level decline averaged over 5 to 20 years. So we want to look at a relatively long cycle. 5 years is kind of our minimum time period for having data to assess a trend. 20 years being the longest, that's roughly 2 decadal climate cycles worth. However, if we're getting 0.4 feet of water level decline over a long period of time, we want to have some backstop, and we've chosen 25 feet of total decline from highest known as that backstop. I already mentioned we want to have at least 5 years of recent data to make that decision, and otherwise we've written in that the default of not having that 5 years of data is that water is not available for further allocation until we develop it. And lastly, we've received a lot of feedback about, the state is diverse and varies in climate, geology, what have you. So we wanted the option to have basin program rules provide a local definition for reasonably stable water levels. Could be more or less, I don't know what to use, strict. However, we don't want to have a situation where we have reasonably stable water levels defined as something less stringent than declined excessively. So we can't have both of them be true at the same time. So we've received a lot of, or had a lot of discussion, received a lot of feedback through the RAP process. Folks have talked about this being not restrictive enough, as even small declines in water levels can affect groundwater dependent ecosystems, springs and seeps and wetlands. We've also received comments that it's too restrictive, that it'll limit the use of the full saturated thickness of the aquifer. And that especially with thick aquifers, that more decline would be appropriate. I do want to make sure that I mention at this point, we received a letter from the Central Oregon Cities organization about our staff report, where we were responding to some comments they made. And we had a meeting with them where they had summed up well log data over time to show how wells were drilled past the first water table, and how that was deepening over time. And they had summed it up for 50 feet, 75 feet, I believe. And we had taken that value and extrapolated it. And it was unclear in the staff report, I think, upon rereading, that was on our initiative, but they had provided us with how many wells over discrete time periods were less than 75 feet drilled into the aquifer. And we summed that to say, hey, based on this information provided to us, there are thus many wells that are less than 75 feet completed into the aquifer. And we sum that up to get some idea of the magnitude of wells that would be expected to go dry given a 75-foot water level decline. Rough estimate, just want to make sure that anybody that's read the staff report knows that was our assessment. So with that, that's what I had on reasonably stable water levels. I realize I'm running a bit long, so I'm going to push on and have discussion at the end. Oh, I guess I was going to do one more thing. I also want to just make sure that I clearly express the differences between our proposed definition of reasonably stable and our existing definition of declined excessively. Both have a rate test, reasonably stable being half a foot per year averaged over 5 to 20 years, declined excessively being 3 foot per year for at least 10 years. They both have a total magnitude, which is 25 feet for reasonably stable, 50 feet for declined excessively. And they both have a also percentage of aquifer thickness. Both of them right now as written, they're or statements. So it's this total value for relatively thick aquifers, or 8% or 15% for thinner aquifers. So if you have, I can think of, I don't know, Lapine area, there's a real shallow, like 20-foot shallow aquifer right near the surface. It wouldn't make sense to manage that to 50-foot decline. So we would revert to the percentages at that point.
Or the Cooper Mountain, when we're to 1,000 feet,
Well,
would be the other, the
that's
opposite.
right, that's right. So for the Cooper Mountain 1,000-foot, we would revert to this 25 feet or 50-foot total. And again, that's to preserve the year-on-year refilling, if you would, of those aquifers. So even though they're thick, we're proposing that reasonably stable means that, you know, that thickness is my example of the charged canal, right? Like that is there and is useful in the conveyance of water from a recharge area to a discharge area. And if that dynamic storage was dropped down, that would affect the flow patterns of the throughput, if you will, of groundwater year on year. So, all right. Key issue number 2, we've redefined potential for substantial interference with surface water or proposed. I've shown this picture in several other presentations, and this is Eagle Creek in late August in an area with no snowpack, no dam regulation, and it's flowing after 3 months of no rain. And I just put this in as a thought process that I suspect many people have this experience, that we can go to streams in Oregon, they're flowing, last weekend before we had the big rainfall, they were still all flowing. And that flow is groundwater discharge, right? That's what maintains our summertime flows. And those summertime flows are depended on by some of the earliest water right holders, right? Like they've laid claim to that, and that's often when their needs are unmet. Just revisit this kind of fundamental generality that when groundwater is pumped from a hydraulically connected system, as I said in the first slide, the percentage of groundwater that comes from 2 sources, from storage and from stream flow depletion, changes over pumping time. And at early time, almost all the water comes from storage and very quickly drops off and approaches 0. At early time, the amount that comes from stream flow depletion is 0, but very quickly rises to some amount that's going to approach 100% given enough time, depending on the geologic situation. To make that generalization real, I've got an example of modeled stream flow depletion. So this doesn't include the capture portion, just the stream flow depletion portion from a numerical computer model in the Deschutes Basin. And essentially, this is showing when the pump turns on in this simulation at month 49, I guess. We get a building of the percentage of that pumping rate coming from stream flow depletion that's more than 80% after about 30 years. So the simulation is 4 wells pumping at, I don't know, doesn't really matter, but I think it was really 1.5 CFS. They're located 20 miles from the regional hydraulically connected stream flow. And if this were the case that we are looking at assessing today, we would only we wouldn't look at this at all because the wells are so far away. And if we did, we would only look at the impact after 1 year, which is about 3% of the pumping rate. And just because we don't consider this in our allocation decisions today doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. So, this building over time of the impact to the stream is growing for every hydraulically connected groundwater right that's issued. And that is in summary, the major change that we're making is we're saying we today look at wells within a mile, pumping impacts within a season, and we are expanding that to look at essentially all hydraulically connected wells and their impacts at the full time period of the right? So we issue a right for groundwater pumping. That right is good essentially forever unless it's not used. So we're looking at basically very long time periods, time to full capture. Let me be clear on this. And therefore, our proposed rules mean that for hydraulically connected groundwater availability, it's going to closely match surface water availability. Because again, getting a little ahead of time to your point, Floyd, if surface water is already fully allocated, or if the water master is regulating back water users on a particular stream, then to issue rights in the future that would be junior to all rights that we know will further impact those streams. I can't recommend anything other than to say water is not available in that case, because we're going to further impact already over appropriated surface water. And that's going to be a big change. I want to make sure that that's clear to the committee, to the commission on Thursday, to anybody attending. So as you could expect, we've heard a lot of comment about that. Again, from the RAC, we've heard comments on both sides that it's too restrictive. It's a significant reduction in potential future water rights issued. We've also heard, well, this isn't quite forward looking enough, because even though we're looking at water availability now with climate evolution and what have you, that, we aren't taking our best available science of what will be in 20 years into account. So we've noted those comments on both sides of the ledger. We've had some additional feedback. We've heard insufficient or outdated data comments and requests that we gather more data before acting. We have heard the need for additional and or improved tools. So we have, conservation incentives, we have transfers, and we've heard they could be streamlined, they could be made more useful. We don't necessarily have markets right now, but folks have brought it up as a potential beneficial way to allocate what we've allocated in order to take the water that we've allocated to date and move it around to the highest and best use using markets. And I should probably reorder these, but storage and water reuse, again, programs that we currently have that we've heard comments that could be changed in one way or the other. So want to acknowledge that, and we understand that that's likely to all come into play probably pretty rapidly in the future, in my individual opinion, should these rules be adopted.
Can I answer just one?
Yeah,
quick
go ahead.
comment?
Yeah.
I think it's important to know that even though there were lots of, comments, people being alarmed, identification of negative impacts, this is going to shut down this, it'll influence that. I don't think I heard a single comment that said this isn't necessary, that some reworking of these rules to avoid issuing additional water rights in areas where water is not available, that we needed a new framework. I didn't hear anybody say the system is fine, leave it alone. I think that's an important point. Even critics said,
Good point.
these revisions are needed. 8 revisions are needed.
Yeah, thank you. So we heard again on the right-hand column here, proposed rules may negatively impact future municipal growth, future ag expansion. We also heard that failure to act can impact investments made on the reliance of existing water rights, as well as on domestic water well supply availability. So there's lots of viewpoints that we've been working to balance within the prior appropriation system. So with that, next steps, we've talked about this already, so I'll just real quickly breeze through this. We finished up our last RAC meeting. We're planning on the notice of proposed rulemaking starting a 90-day comment period November 1st. Planning on having public hearings, and I don't know, I guess I could say our GWAC and our next GWAC discussion is right around here, November 14th. We'll also be talking with the commission then, run public comment through February 1st, review the comments and provide that to the commission at their spring meeting is the current plan. So with that, I'm going to escape out of here so we can see everybody that's on screen, hopefully. And start the discussion. Screen share, maybe that's what I need to do. There we go. And maybe before I get too far, I'll pull up the comments just to see if there's anything in the comments. Oh, which of course we have turned off for public meetings. Okay. So with that, I know that I stopped you, Floyd, so I want to give you first
Okay, so.
first position here.
First, I agree with Phil that there's something that needs to be done. But I also think that it needs to be done in a more scientific aspect than modeling and maybe basically guesswork, in my opinion. I don't quite understand the WARS process that you use. And I have a hard time. You want to protect senior water right users, but however, you always issue. With 2.5 feet acre feet of water.
Yeah.
When in fact, most of them don't use 2.5 acre feet of water. But in the woods, do you use that when you're figuring your modeling as a 2.5 feet, or do you use what's actually used?
Okay, so let's step back. WARS is the Water Availability Reporting System. That is the surface water availability tool that was developed, I believe, in the early 90s that we have used to determine surface water availability for several decades. You just heard Bryn here that we received money to update that. So that's going to be a 6-year project, as I understand it. And that is to update the period of record. So the water availability reporting is static from the sense of what natural stream flow is. It's based on a 30-year record. I don't have the dates memorized, but some 30-year record in the past. And one part at least of the update is to bring that record forward to use our most modern data. So essentially how that keys into the groundwater allocation is that if a surface water source is fully allocated, then and groundwater is hydraulically connected to it, then we're saying that would impact a fully allocated surface water body. As far as the argument that not all surface water is used all the time, my understanding is that is true, and it could be. I mean, it could be. There are rights out there for folks to use up to 2.5 or 3, whatever it is, acre feet per acre, and they couldn't put in a more water intensive crop at any point. And from the surface water perspective, the solution to that is to regulate off surface water users. And we do that regularly with the Water Master Corps. However, on the groundwater side of the ledger, we've really only have the critical groundwater area tool to do that. And as you heard earlier, that's a very long process to get in place. And as groundwater impacts grow over time, I showed that graph of stream depletion growing over time. If you stop pumping and turn them off, those impacts also dissipate over a very long time, or could be long given distance and what have you. So from the perspective of regulating groundwater like surface water, where we can just turn it on and off, it's not effective that way just because of the physical system. So, so again, in order to limit the need to create critical groundwater areas and curtail back rights that we've issued, we are recommending to the commission that we, well, and the commission has asked us, actually has initiated for us to come back and present them with a process to ensure that allocation is made when water is available. And we've recommended what we think is the best way to do that.
Hey, Justin, can I jump in here for a second, please?
Sure. Go ahead.
Good morning, it's Annette again. So I wanted to try to answer Floyd's question in a more direct way. The
Okay.
way that the water availability reporting system works is it debits the water availability basin, and what it debits depends on what kind of use it is. And then the database has consumptive use estimates pertaining to that use of water, and all the water that is not consumed is added back into the water availability basin. So we are not, the water availability reporting system is not assuming consumptive use of the full water right. It makes estimates on what the actual consumptive use is, depending on what the beneficial use in the water right is. And then whatever water is not used is credited back into that water availability basin and is available for use by other water rights holders. So we are working on a fact sheet for the water availability reporting system that will clarify some of this, but I wanted to be clear about that in answering your question, Floyd.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
I guess part of the concern, I guess, would be from the irrigators and agriculture and the industry is you made a comment that all surface water, or most all surface water, I guess I should correct myself, is already over appropriated. So if any new well as proposed has any impact at all on surface water, it's going to be denied. So it appears to me that very few wells, if any at all, are going to be approved in the future, which is drastically going to impact agriculture and other industries, even municipalities. So that's when I go back to, I think we're pushing this through too fast. I think we need more scientific data. I can't support something that's being pushed through without more data backing it up instead of trying to make new rules.
And can you give me an example of what data you would want to, what would be persuasive to you?
Something more scientific, like actually looking at the fully penetrated use of an aquifer and the stability of it. I had all kinds of notes that I don't have with me now.
Okay.
Lloyd, can I pitch in one real quickly?
So I'm sorry, Malia, if you could just wait, I want to make sure that the committee gets their chance.
I'm
And
just trying to
yeah,
help Lloyd with his notes.
well.
I guess.
It's OGWA comments, yeah.
So I guess I'm just frustrated that we're not using more conservation. We're not taking the senior water right users that are using this water, not going to them, letting them know that we're having an issue, and asking them to slow their use of water down. I think that there's a lot of them that would. Like I said before, if I was a farmer and I knew I'd run out of water in 10 years, or if I slowed down, I could use it for 30 years. I think that I would slow down and use it for 30 years. Sustain it, and then instead of being just shut off, run out of water. I think that we've ought to fully develop and look closely and further into aquifer storage and recovery in all aspects, because I think that has a great impact on how we're going to, go on into the future. And it seems to me that we look at these charts that are always kind of a decline, but if you have a decline in the usage, you're not gonna have a decline in withdrawal. So if we could educate and on conservation and, get out to these senior water rights, the issues that are going on, that maybe we could have a reduction in production and an increase in decline.
I agree with what you're saying quite a bit, and as somebody who's spent about half of his time working in Washington State and watching them go through this, I mean, that's what happens. But what it seems like what happens, the sequence is something like these rule changes happen, and it changes the way that people can acquire water for whatever it is, right? And it suddenly become, it's a whole new world, right? And that's what you're saying. This is good. This would be a whole new world for agriculture. It's going to be a huge change. It's going to impact a lot of people. I think that's your point. So watching Washington State have a couple of Supreme Court decisions that changed everything. It's what happens next that's interesting, that focus on reuse, conservation, these recharge projects, whether it's recharging reused reclaimed water, right? To offset these impacts and allow new uses to move forward. All that sort of flowed from the changes to the water laws in that state. It's like, okay, well, now we've got this whole new world and it's a problem. What do we do next? And the burden didn't necessarily fall to individuals in Washington State. There were these new programs, new rules set up, money flowed towards projects in different ways. Counties got involved, like a county entity has an interest in preserving industry and agriculture in that county. It's key to the economy. So how do we get involved to make sure that our county continues to grow and thrive? All that happened post changes that are similar to this. And so, it almost seemed like as long as the status quo was going to be maintained, the motivation to do those different things, they didn't happen in Washington anyways. So it's an interesting point. I agree with everything you said. It's just what does it take to get all that stuff to happen? And there it was the Foster decision and the Hearst decision that said, well, we're pretty much not going to grow in the dry parts of the state, and in the wet parts of the state where we have reservations of stream flow for fish. Well, that's almost the same problem, even though we're on the wet side. And so that's when all these basin plans and programs and county governments and grant programs, state routing money towards these projects to essentially almost create mitigation banks of actual wet water, the boosted flows to allow additional development. That's when all that started happening.
And this all happened close to what these rules are. And I guess what I'm trying to emphasize is why can't we do it pre all of these rules? That when the department is required to monitor the waters of all the state of Oregon, in charge of all the water in the state of Oregon. And there's a lot of over appropriation. So all of these years that led up to this, I mean, I'm not trying to put the blame only on the department, but I mean, if it was monitored properly to start with, we wouldn't have all this over appropriation. Although we do have growth and we do have larger industries and, and more need for water. But I'd like to see push for more education and conservation instead of developing rules that are going to put a halt to everything. I guess that's kind of where I'm coming.
Go ahead, Richard.
I'm unclear as to what the procedure is to determine whether it's a hydraulically connected well.
Yeah,
Because the aquifer that I live on doesn't appear to be hydraulically connected to surface water.
yes, yeah.
And so I'm not sure what the procedure would be for going through to verify that they're not hydraulically connected so that you could drill.
Sure. So hydraulic connection remains as it is today, which is a determination by the hydrogeologist reviewing an application based on, best available information. And I'll say the term is conceptual model. That's how we understand or picture the system to work. And so based on the aggregate knowledge of what's the geology, where are the wells, what are the water levels in the wells? Do we see gradients from recharge areas, usually in the uplands, down toward streams? All of that information goes into determination of hydraulic connection. I put up the picture from the Deschutes Basin of water pouring out, right? So like, that's an obvious example on one end. The other end are Columbia River basalt aquifers are a common example, and that's what you're in, obviously. Of where,
Confined.
yeah, well, more than just confined, but like, yeah, that it's the confinement plus the understanding that it's multiple layers of confinement, plus the understanding of the age of the water where we have it, plus the understanding of the problem. And this is like, I want to make this clear too. The issue is that if you're not hydraulically connected to surface water, if there's no outlet for groundwater flow, then essentially all you've got is storage. And if all you've got is storage, you've got your pump in a swimming pool, and you're going to see water levels decline over time. And we've obviously got some reasonably stable water level rules as well. So there's a flip side to hydraulically connected or not. There's that graph of, that graph I showed. If you're not hydraulically connected, it just looks like storage, and the water level's just gonna drop over time. Now, it could be a very large storage reservoir, and that could be used for quite some time. So Fort Rock is perhaps an example of that, where it's been maintaining agriculture for quite a while at relatively shallow, less than half a foot a year decline. So also in that case, they did exactly as you say, Floyd. We together happened in the 80s, so I'm not actually exactly sure, but that area is classified and we don't allow additional use there. But the senior users that have been using, I believe, have a much longer trajectory in front of them of use of that stored water than they would otherwise have if we didn't have the Fort Rock limited area. So.
Thank you.
Yeah. Marshall, I want to make sure that I don't miss you and anything you want to add in.
No, not really. This is a really interesting discussion. I think, I kind of totally get where Floyd's coming from. And I really appreciated Phil's comments. I think, I'll have to say the department would be remiss in not sort of starting with a fairly sort of solid assumption that aquifers are connected to streams. That's where groundwater goes. And there is no free lunch. There is no such thing as impact-free groundwater development. And it's either going to come from storage, and you're going to see declines, or it's coming from some boundary, and the boundaries are streams and springs and wetlands and stuff like that. So what rules do, and what we try to get our mind around, is really identifying and dealing with trade-offs. This is how I think about it. And if you write rules that kind of pretend that there are circumstances where, other than Columbia River basalt aquifers that are really deep and you're just seeing nothing but declines, those are really poorly connected to stream systems. But everywhere else where we're pumping groundwater and we don't see year-to-year declines, we see them recover every year. That water's coming from a boundary and it's a stream. So the challenge here, and I think the committee, the RAC committee, I applaud them because this was a really hard nut to crack, has tried to come up with a structure to just help deal reasonably with those trade-offs. So, you know, I read the rules last night, and it seems to me that wells, that when you start looking at wells or issues, at least with declines that are more than a mile from a stream, at some point it triggers a critical groundwater area designation. Is that correct? Did I interpret that correctly? When they start talking about wells with different distances from surface water?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is Division 9, what I'd call Rule 50 dash 0050. That has some criteria in there about regulating streams within a mile. That a similar rule, Division 25 intended for the Klamath, has been overturned for that rule. And so I acknowledge it is in there, and I really want to separate it from our allocation work. What we tried to do with that portion of Division 9 was keep it the same as it was. And we had to cut and paste. We had cut some things from above that needed to be below to make it function as it does today. And we're really focused on the allocation. So I don't know if this exactly answers your question, but
It kind of did. I just,
yeah.
But that's sort of, I noticed Tim lit up on my screen, so I imagine he wants to weigh in here, but so I get that this is hard. It seems like for this process to be meaningful, that everybody's gone through this rewriting of sort of the whole allocation strategy. There was bound and determined to be some heartache that's going to come out of it, and sometimes that heartache is going to, like Phil pointed out, result in some more serious efforts at innovation, at conservation, at other strategies to use. But you can't ignore the fact that there's no free lunch with groundwater, and there are areas where we've been paying the price, or where we want to avoid paying the price in the future. And I'm looking forward to the discussion next, at our next meeting, where we really get down to the nitty gritty a little bit more. But I think you're headed in the right direction. One more comment. I looked at the, Floyd, you mentioned the use of models, and models are sort of in my mind, aren't front and center in these rules at all. It seems like it's pretty largely data driven. I searched, between Division 8, Division 9, and I think what the other ones were, 410 and the other one. The word model doesn't even show up that much. And where it does, it's sort of a list of one of many techniques that can be used. But in all model, using that term that's based on a well-established mathematics for determining groundwater surface water connection, anyway. So I kind of realize that implementing to kind of refining these, it might take a little more effort to get everybody on the same page, but I think they're headed in the right direction. And I personally didn't have any heartburn over what I read so far. I'll shut up. Anyway, thanks.
Any more feedback from members here on the rulemaking agenda item? And if not, public comment?
Yeah.
The city of Kaiser just completed a well, they're almost completed. The depth of 400 feet in alluvial. which obviously is gonna be hydraulically connected. So what is the future of Kaiser, which is in all alluvial formations for growth? And potential of doing wells, if it's gonna have an impact on surface water? If we implement. these-
Sure, yeah, so, I'll just say, I don't know Kaiser's particular situation, so I'm gonna talk generally about municipal water rights. So municipalities are in a kind of special development class where they are allowed to hold water rights permits with long development time, so 50-year development time. So the municipalities I've worked with in the past in general have a planning department. They plan for decades of growth. They've planned their water supplies into the future, and they can grow into that. So I don't know, again, for Kaiser, I don't know if they're drilling a well now and applying for a water right later, or if they have water rights in place that they are growing into. But if they are growing into them, then those all remain as they are today. If a municipality has determined that their growth rate is such that they need a new water right, under the rules as they're drafted right now, they would need to, and they're hydraulically connected to a stream that's fully appropriated, or water levels have declined beyond the reasonably stable definition, then they would need to look to other sources. So they could potentially look to transfers of other existing rights. They could continue to build on conservation. Lots of municipalities are doing that. They are required to have water management conservation plans and to implement some sort of conservation measures. Those are the two that immediately pop into my head, but that would be under the rules as they're written now, that would be their path forward.
Most all of Kaiser's water is coming from wells.
Okay.
I drove one several years ago, and all of their wells are currently. Kaiser, yeah.
So I guess ASR would be another potential strategy to meet peak demands in summer if that's what they were building for. That's another mechanism that can operate within the proposed rule set. There's still that option to take water when it's available in the winter, inject it into the ground, pull it out in summer. So.
Yeah. The only good thing I see coming from this is, like Phil was saying, it's gonna trigger more conservation, it's gonna trigger more reaction. So that's the one good thing that I can.
And it's hard, like your question, initially your question is, so what will the future hold in this situation? And, you know, in some cases, I mean, things happen that you can't see coming from here. You know, is additional water available in the Columbia for Pasco? You know, 10 years ago, everybody would say, well, no, where would that come from? Well, after all these changes, Department of Ecology negotiated a bunch of stuff I don't understand at Lake Roosevelt to allow more water to flow down the Columbia to be made available for municipal and industrial and agricultural water supply, right? 10 years prior, you would never thought something like that was going to happen. So I would just say, you know, you don't know what the future holds, and necessity is the mother of invention. And things that you didn't think were going to be possible by rule, well, rules get changed in the face of the desire to continue to grow and have economic prosperity and everything else. You know?
Justin, you mentioned aquifer recharge for the municipalities.
Yeah.
Where can I look up the quality rules, the water quality that they have to maintain when they're doing their recharge? See, I'm really concerned about the city of Beaverton using street runoff for recharge and only partially treating it before they pump it into my aquifer that I drink every day. It seems ridiculous to me to pump only water that does not meet drinking water requirements into an aquifer and contaminate it.
Yeah, so, shorter answer is I'm gonna follow up with an email. I'll do that to the
Okay.
GWAC and I'll put it in the meeting minutes as well. And the actual answer is much longer and we're.
I assumed it was
We're
like-
over, yeah.
Well,
Be cognizant of our time. So, yeah,
Okay, thank you.
yeah, sure thing.
And there's, for every permit, there is a public comment period.
Yes,
Yeah, so you have an opportunity to review.
Right, but the notification process
Well, that you were talking about a couple
is
meetings back.
clouded.
Right, right.
Because now in my area, the paper of record is the Times. The News Times, and they have 7 pages of public notifications every week. So to look through that is exhausting.
okay. We good to move to public comment?
I think we should.
All right, I see perhaps a couple of people. We've got one person in the room to make public comment. I wanted to check in online with Jesse Talbot, Leslie, and Greg to ask if any of you would like to make a public comment too. Okay, thank you, Jesse. Any comments from Jesse? All right, so I guess Leslie or Greg, if you, let me see, I guess we've got a chat here, one moment.
Yeah, this is Greg. I'm not planning on giving a public comment today. Thank you.
Okay, all right, sounds great. Then we've got one public comment from Malia Capillas, who's in the room here, so Malia, floor is yours. And I guess I want to say thanks for everybody that's held in there with us, and Malia, we're 40 minutes over, so just keep that in mind.
And my parking time is nearing its end.
Uh,
Okay, I am Malia Capillas. I am here representing Greg to testify on his behalf for the Oregon Groundwater Association. I'm also here for Pacific Hydrogeology. And my residence is 18487 South Valley Vista Road, Malino, Oregon. And I'm primarily here to testify regarding the groundwater allocation rules. And there's a few points that I'd like to make, and I do have handouts. So I'm going to start with Greg's first. And the top page is his qualifications, and the bottom part is stuff that he has already submitted to the record for the RAP, which would just be. And our concern, or his concern, is that these rules will essentially shut down the state's new water rights. And we also have concerns where we can see that there are situations where these rules, contrary to what Water Resources is saying, has the potential to impact future artificial recharge and our artificial storage and recovery projects. And we think that there may be an alternative management solutions that could make these rules completely unnecessary. And maybe we don't have to go down through the path that Washington did of actually passing the rules, that maybe these rules hanging over everybody's heads could have that same effect without passing them. And this other option is a vision that I have developed that's actually become a part of my doctoral dissertation. And the key issues that we see, or I see, is that we've lost a critical part of our recharge through the way we've developed our impervious surfaces. We've lost our beaver dams. The list goes on, and I have another handout. And so one of the first steps that I see is that we need to start working on recapturing the recharge that we have lost to our system. Because that recharge is what is critical for in the summertime, and then, eventually some of it flows out to the streams and some of it can then be used for irrigation. Another big issue that I'm seeing is our commingling well problem in the Columbia River basalts. In some of the areas that I work in, we have reached the point where, because the basalt aquifers were commingled and decline measures were taken, we're actually seeing those water levels start to level out. And it's not because water use has been restricted or curtailed, it's because from the commingling, the static water levels are now reaching their new static or their new equilibrium. And so these areas were never overdrafted, they were commingled. And I think we need to sit down and go back through and see what we can do to split out these systems so that we can recover a shallow basalt system that's more directly connected to the streams, and artificially recharge and do aquifer storage and recovery to maintain the deeper basalt system that's currently with an unofficial ASR project through commingled wells. And I have a presentation on this vision that I would like to present to GWAC before these allocation rules are adopted. If the members of GWAC would like for me to give that presentation. And since we think that there may be more options that the state should consider before passing these rules, we propose a pause in the rulemaking process to look at these other options for sustainability. And in the interim, Greg has proposed some changes to the current groundwater review process that may address the commission's initial request that triggered the development of the current allocation rules being discussed. And with that, does anybody have any questions? If there's no questions.
Example of the aquifers in the Columbia River basalt, are you referring to the Moser area?
Mosier, Mount Angel, State and Sublimity are three that come to mind. Butter Creek is probably commingled, Walla Walla is commingled. Yeah. So.
Melina, if you just point of process, if you have electronic copies of these, I will forward them to the rest of the groundwater advisory committee. So that are here that are online. Otherwise, I'll scan these, but it would be a better copy.
I can easily provide you with a digital copy.
Thank you.
No problem. You're welcome. Okay.
If my last comment would be the commingling in the wells, we'll be seeing the Mosier. I'm assuming you're all familiar with what we're in the Mosier area. The department has actually gone in and has spent some money and some time fixing some of these wells and developed new rules. I was on that rules advisory committee on the construction of the wells. And so we see a recovery there. And if we have this issue in the future, some of this allocated money that we have might be spent wisely in fixing some of these. I think the commingling laws have been in effect for several decades, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think.
And for several decades, well, we're instructed in commingling, but the department never enforced the commingling laws up until just recently. So,
Well, I would add that we have more information to enforce them as time goes on, but yes, I agree, yeah.
I could add some historical to that. When I first started practicing down here in Oregon, my company around 1994, 95. At that time, I was told by a staff person at Water Resources Department that they considered the Columbia River basalt to be all one aquifer. And therefore, they required people to continue to deepen their wells to chase the water level down. And that was their thinking up until, yes, we did get, or you did, everybody obtained additional information that showed that that premise was not valid.
I do have a question for you.
Sure.
Yeah, and it's just because there's a lot of information here, I'm trying to absorb some of it really quickly.
Yeah.
So I like a lot of these ideas here. Can I ask you to repeat one of the initial premise, like your position is that a plan like this, or a vision like this, if implemented, would allow the state to avoid the rule changes that are presented. Okay, I just want to be clear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is based on what other states are doing and has been successful with. And in some cases, the states are evolving from where they started to more of this vision.
Mhm.
And it combined, it's taken me 16 years working on my dissertation to finally get the full picture pulled together.
Thank you.
Like I said, I'd be happy to give my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Lily.
Okay, just last call online, want to make sure nobody else make public comment at this point in time. And again, we'll be revisiting this topic in this venue and others, so. I'll make my final pitch. The commission meeting can be online just like this, both on YouTube if you just want to listen, or online if you want to make a comment to the commission individually. So that's Thursday afternoon.
Thank you. Well, if there's nothing else, take a moment, motion to adjourn. So move. There is something else.
Well, no, we can't approve minutes, but we're going to, review the word of it. 13. You have a tenant present. I think Phil was present on that, but his name's not in that.
No, I was not present. So on the last meeting, for the last meeting?
When Adam Sussman testified.
No, I think, yeah, I wasn't here.
Okay.
Both Marshall and I were gone. And Ken chaired that meeting before us.
That's it.
Thanks for thinking of me.
Always.
So we had a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Okay,
All right, thank
all
you.
right. Thanks, everybody, for sticking with us long. Really appreciate it, and really appreciate the conversation from everybody. All right.
Good. So, we make a motion and approve it without a quorum.
To adjourn?
To adjourn, yeah.
I'll ask for forgiveness on that one. Yeah. I'll take the heat if I'm going down for that.
Darn, I think we should stay until we get a quorum.
All right. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Greg.
Welcome. Have a good day.
Thank you. See you later.